Wow, this is some pretty heavy stuff we're getting into today. The Civil War.
Yeah.
You've given us a really interesting mix of sources. Some focusing on the war itself, others on how it shaped the U.S. afterward. It seems like you're interested in not just what happened, but WHY. It still matters to us now, 150 plus years later.
Absolutely. And looking at the mix of primary sources, letters, diaries, alongside the scholarly analysis, that tells me you want to understand the human side of this history as well as the big picture.
Okay, so our deep dive today is into the lasting legacy of the Civil War.
Hmm.
We'll uncover surprising connections to modern-day politics, race relations, even how Americans view death. Get ready for some aha moments.
You might be surprised just how deeply the past shapes the present.
Uh-huh.
Historian James McPherson, he argues this very point in his book, The War That Forged a Nation.
Okay.
He says understanding the Civil War is crucial to understanding America today, and I think he's right.
I've definitely seen those connections. For example, the debate over voting rights, which is huge right now, has clear links to the Reconstruction era following the Civil War. It's like history is rhyming, isn't it?
Exactly. The Civil War era wasn't just about ending slavery, it was about fundamentally reshaping the relationship between the government and its citizens. McPherson calls this the emergence of positive liberty.
Okay, positive liberty.
Yeah.
That sounds like something I'd need a dictionary for, but I have a feeling you can explain it better than Webster.
Haha. Think of it this way. The Bill of Rights is full of shall-nots.
Right.
It's about limiting what the government can do to individuals. Positive liberty is the flip side. It's about what the government must do to ensure equality and opportunity for all its citizens.
So the Civil War amendments, which granted citizenship and voting rights to formerly enslaved people, those are examples of positive liberty in action.
Exactly.
That's a huge shift in thinking.
It really is. And Lincoln himself grappled with this evolving idea of government power. He actually illustrated it with a parable about a shepherd, a wolf, and a black sheep.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lincoln telling stories. This is better than any history textbook.
So the shepherd, he represents the government. He sees the wolf, representing those who fear any government power, about to attack the black sheep, representing those who needed protection, in this case, enslaved people. The shepherd steps in, uses his power to save the vulnerable.
So before the war, the focus was on limiting government, but after, it became about using government power to actively protect rights.
Exactly.
And we can see how that idea still plays out today, right? Think about debates over things like healthcare or social safety nets.
Absolutely. The Civil War era helped redefine the role of government in American society, and those debates continue to this day.
Right.
But what's fascinating is how even seemingly unrelated events contributed to the tensions that led to war. Take California, for instance.
Wait, California, that feels like a million miles from the battlefields of Gettysburg. What's the connection?
It's all about the delicate balance of power in the years leading up to the war. When California entered the Union as a free state in 1850, it actually ended up empowering pro-slavery forces.
Now that's surprising. How did that happen?
Well, a group of Southern-born politicians known as the Chivalry Faction, they quickly gained control of California politics.
Okay.
These men used their influence to secure federal jobs and contracts for their supporters, essentially controlling a huge chunk of the state's resources.
Well, even though California was a free state, it was actually helping to prop up pro-slavery interests. It's like a political judo move.
Exactly, and these California senators were pushing pro-slavery agendas at the national level.
Wow.
Further inflaming the already tense situation, they even attempted to use the filibuster to create more slave states. It's a reminder that seemingly isolated events can have huge ripple effects across the nation.
It makes you realize how interconnected history really is. But speaking of interconnectedness, we can't forget about the human cost of this conflict. We're talking about 750,000 casualties, a staggering number. How did people cope with so much death and suffering?
That's a question historians continue to grapple with. One perspective comes from historian Harry Stout, author of Upon the Altar of the Nation.
Okay.
He argues that as the North adopted tactics of total war, targeting not just armies but also civilian infrastructure, the conflict became increasingly morally ambiguous.
So the very nature of warfare was changing, becoming more brutal, and that raised new questions about the justness of the war itself.
Exactly. Not all historians agree with Stout's assessment of total war, but the debate is important because it makes us think critically about how we judge the actions of leaders and soldiers in such extraordinary circumstances.
And speaking of extraordinary circumstances, How did ordinary people process the sheer scale of death? I mean, was death seen differently back then?
It was. You have two historians offering contrasting views on this. Mark Shantz in Awaiting the Heavenly Country and Drew Gilpin Faust in This Republic of Suffering.
Okay, so what were their takes? Were people just numb to death because it was so common?
Shantz argues that 19th century Americans had a different relationship with death. They believed in a literal afterlife and found solace in the idea of being reunited with loved ones.
Okay.
This made death, while still tragic, less terrifying.
So maybe faith provided a kind of buffer against the overwhelming grief? It's hard to imagine that kind of widespread belief in a literal heaven today.
Right. And Faust, while acknowledging the importance of faith, focuses more on the rituals surrounding death,
Okay.
like the good death ideal, dying at home surrounded by loved ones. These practices, she argues, help people cope with the psychological trauma of loss.
It's fascinating to think about how those beliefs and practices shaped people's experiences, especially for soldiers on the battlefield. Did those facing death think they were going straight to heaven? Did that impact their courage or their fear?
It's certainly a question worth pondering. And it leads us to another group whose experiences are crucial to understanding the war: Black soldiers.
Hmm.
Over 180,000 Black men served in the Union Army, fighting for their own freedom and transforming the war's very meaning.
We have David Blight's A Slave No More to thank for shedding light on this often overlooked aspect of the war.
Yeah.
He unearthed two incredibly powerful slave narratives that offer a first-hand perspective on what it meant to escape slavery and then fight for the very country that had enslaved you.
These narratives, especially those of John Washington and Wallace Turnage, challenge us to rethink our understanding of patriotism and sacrifice. These men weren't just fighting for the Union, they were fighting for their own humanity and the future of their people.
And they did it at a time when racism was rampant, even in the North.
Yeah,
To risk your life for a nation that still denied you basic rights
yeah.
is true courage.
Their stories are a testament to the enduring human desire for freedom and equality. And Blight's book gives us a glimpse into the complexities of emancipation, how it was experienced on the ground, not just as a political proclamation.
Their literacy, their struggles, their journeys to freedom, these are the details that bring history to life. And speaking of individuals who shaped history, we can't ignore Abraham Lincoln.
Lincoln's journey, particularly on the issue of slavery, is one of the most fascinating aspects of this era, and Eric Foner's The Fiery Trial traces that evolution beautifully.
He started out opposing the expansion of slavery, but not necessarily calling for its end. And then there's his early support for colonization, the idea of sending freed slaves to Africa. It seems so contradictory to the Lincoln we remember as the great emancipator.
It's crucial to understand that Lincoln was operating within a specific historical context.
Right.
The idea of racial equality as we understand it today was not widely accepted then.
So while some of Lincoln's early views might seem shocking to us now, he was still considered fairly progressive for his time. But what's so remarkable is how he grew and evolved throughout the war.
Absolutely. He was constantly challenged, learning from his experiences and from the people around him.
Yeah.
And ultimately, he came to see emancipation not just as a political strategy, but as a moral imperative.
His Emancipation Proclamation, issued in 1863, wasn't just a military order. It was a declaration of human freedom that reverberated across the nation and throughout history.
And it's important to remember that evolution didn't end there. Just consider his final public speech where he endorsed limited Black suffrage. It was a radical idea for the time and one that infuriated John Wilkes Booth, foreshadowing the assassination that would soon follow.
It's chilling to think about how those events were intertwined. But Lincoln's legacy as a leader, especially as commander-in-chief, is undeniable.
And that leadership role wasn't something he was born with. Lincoln had to learn on the job, navigating the complexities of military strategy and politics.
He had to grasp the different levels of military leadership. Policy, strategy, operations, tactics. It wasn't just about wearing a fancy hat and giving inspiring speeches.
Exactly. And one of the biggest challenges he faced was the issue of political generals. These were men appointed to leadership positions based on their political connections rather than their military expertise.
And those appointments didn't always go well, did they? Some were disastrous, leading to major setbacks for the Union Army.
But it's important to remember that Lincoln was under immense pressure to mobilize troops quickly.
Yeah.
And those political connections were often crucial in rallying volunteers to the Union cause.
So it was a balancing act. He needed competent military leaders, but also had to play the political game to keep the war effort going.
And as Lincoln gained experience, merit became more important in his military appointments. But early on, those political considerations played a significant role.
One example that really highlights Lincoln's growing understanding of military leadership is his frustration with George McClellan's inaction in 1861.
Yes, McClellan. He was brilliant at organizing and training troops, but notoriously hesitant to engage in actual combat. Lincoln needed a general who would fight, not just prepare.
McClellan was constantly overestimating the enemy's strength and delaying action, which drove Lincoln to distraction. It really reveals the clash between Lincoln's evolving understanding of war and McClellan's more cautious approach.
It's a fascinating study in leadership styles, and it highlights the immense pressure Lincoln was under to achieve victory.
And once that victory was finally achieved, a whole new set of challenges arose. The nation had to figure out how to rebuild and reunite after such a brutal conflict.
We call it Reconstruction, but in many ways it was a continuation of the war by other means, a battle over the meaning of freedom and the South's place in the reunited nation.
And it was a brutal battle, with shocking levels of violence directed at Black Americans and those who supported their rights. We're talking about hundreds, maybe thousands killed.
The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups emerged during this period, terrorizing Black communities and undermining efforts to establish racial equality.
It's heartbreaking to think about how the hope for a more just and equitable society was met with such fierce resistance. And it makes you wonder how much progress was actually made during Reconstruction.
That's a complex question, and one we'll delve into further as we explore the legacies of this tumultuous period in American history.
It's clear that the echoes of the Civil War reverberate far beyond the battlefields and into our own time. But before we continue our journey, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned so far.
A moment of reflection is always valuable, especially when dealing with such weighty historical issues. It's striking how even after, the guns fell silent, the battle over the meaning of the Civil War continued.
Right.
We've talked about different historical interpretations, but the way we remember this conflict, it has shaped American identity in profound ways, and those memories are still contested today.
You're right. It's like everyone wants to claim the Civil War for their own cause, even if those causes are totally different.
Exactly. McPherson points out how the war has been used to justify everything from, expanding federal power to advocating for states' rights.
Take Lincoln, for instance. He's become this almost mythical figure, but both sides of the political spectrum, they try to claim his legacy.
That's a great example. The South, for instance, they constructed the narrative of the lost cause.
Right.
They romanticized Confederate heroes and downplayed the role of slavery, portraying the war as a noble but doomed struggle for Southern independence.
And that lost cause narrative had a long reach, didn't it? I mean, we're still dealing with the consequences today. The
Right.
Confederate monuments debate is a prime example.
It is. The way we remember history is never neutral. It's always shaped by the perspectives of those who tell the story. And understanding those perspectives is crucial to being a critical consumer of historical information.
You've got that right. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about some specific legacies of the war that we see playing out in today's world.
One that's particularly relevant is the expansion of federal power.
Okay.
We talked earlier about positive liberty and how the war led to a greater emphasis on the government's role in protecting individual rights.
And that shift has had a huge impact, right? I mean, it laid the groundwork for things like the New Deal and the Civil Rights Movement.
Exactly. The idea that the federal government has a responsibility to ensure equality and opportunity for all citizens,
Yeah.
that's a direct legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction.
But it's also been a source of constant tension and debate. Look at today's political landscape, the battles over healthcare, gun control, even education. They all revolve around this question of what role the federal government should play in our lives.
It's proof that the Civil War didn't neatly resolve these issues. It just set the stage for new battles to be fought. And those battles are still going strong. We're still grappling with what it means to be an American, who gets included, and how we balance individual liberty with the needs of the collective.
Those are big questions, and they remind us that we're not just studying the past, we're living with its consequences. Which brings us back to something you mentioned earlier, the importance of understanding the human side of this history. It's not just about abstract ideas or political debates. It's about the choices people made, the sacrifices they endured, and how those choices shaped generations to come.
And sometimes those human stories challenge our assumptions and force us to confront uncomfortable truths.
Yeah.
Let's revisit those slave narratives from David Blight's A Slave No More, John Washington and Wallace Turnage, their lives before, during, and after the war,
Hmm.
offer incredible insights into the complexity of emancipation.
Their stories are truly remarkable. Both men learned to read and write while enslaved, and both ultimately fought for the Union Army, risking their lives for a country that had denied them basic rights.
It's a powerful testament to their determination to be free.
Yeah.
Think about John Washington. He was hired out as a skilled laborer before the war, which gave him a taste of independence, but he yearned for true freedom. When the war broke out, he escaped to Union lines and enlisted.
And Wallace Turnage's story is equally compelling. He was sold away from his mother at a young age, an experience that left an indelible mark on him. He was determined to escape bondage and eventually seized his opportunity by joining the Union Army.
Both men faced challenges even after emancipation, but they built lives for themselves and their families, contributing to their communities in meaningful ways. Their stories highlight the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of hope.
They also challenge us to reconsider who gets to be called a patriot. These men risk everything for a nation that had treated them as less than human.
Right.
They embody the ideals of America even when America itself wasn't living up to those ideals.
Their stories are a reminder that history is made not just by presidents and generals, but by ordinary individuals who make extraordinary choices in the face of adversity.
Yeah.
And speaking of extraordinary individuals, we can't talk about the Civil War without talking about Abraham Lincoln.
He's such an iconic figure, almost larger than life.
Yeah.
But reading Eric Foner's The Fiery Trial reminds us that Lincoln was a complex human being, wrestling with difficult choices and evolving in his views.
His journey on the issue of slavery is particularly revealing. He started out opposing slavery's expansion, but wasn't necessarily an abolitionist.
Right.
And his early support for colonization, while shocking to us today, was a reflection of the prevailing racial attitudes of his time.
It's hard to reconcile that early Lincoln with the man who issued the Emancipation Proclamation and spoke so eloquently about equality at Gettysburg.
But that's what makes him such a fascinating figure. He was capable of growth and change, of adapting to the extraordinary circumstances he faced. He learned from his experiences, from the people he encountered, and from the moral challenges of the war itself.
And in doing so, he helped to redefine America's core values. His words at Gettysburg, "The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth," have resonated throughout history, inspiring generations to strive for a more just and equitable society.
It's a powerful legacy, though. It's important to acknowledge that Lincoln wasn't acting alone. He was part of a larger movement, influenced by abolitionists, Black activists, and ordinary citizens who pushed him to embrace a more radical vision of freedom.
And he was constantly navigating the pressures of wartime leadership. He had to balance his own evolving views with the political realities of the moment, managing a cabinet full of strong personalities and making difficult decisions about military strategy.
His relationship with General George McClellan is a prime example of those leadership challenges.
Right.
McClellan was a brilliant organizer, but a hesitant commander, always overestimating the enemy and delaying action.
Lincoln was famously frustrated with McClellan's inaction. He needed a general who would fight, who would seize the initiative and push the war towards a decisive conclusion.
But Lincoln also understood the need for caution. He didn't want to rush into a reckless attack that could cost thousands of lives.
It's that constant tension, isn't it? The balance between pushing for action and avoiding unnecessary risk. It's a dilemma that every wartime leader faces.
And it's a reminder that history is messy and complex.
Yeah.
There are rarely easy answers or simple solutions, especially during times of war.
Which makes it all the more important to examine these events with nuance and to avoid simplistic narratives.
Absolutely. And as we continue our deep dive, we'll keep exploring these complexities and tracing the threads of the Civil War's legacy into the present day.
It's clear that the echoes of this conflict are all around us. But before we move on to the next chapter, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've uncovered so far.
A moment of reflection is always valuable, especially when dealing with such profound historical questions.
We've been tracing these echoes of the Civil War through history. It's amazing how these ripples from the past just keep surfacing in our present-day world.
It's a testament to just how deeply this conflict shaped American society.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most striking examples is how this debate over states' rights continues to influence our politics.
Oh, absolutely. It feels like every time there's a hot button issue, whether it's gun control, environmental regulations, or even healthcare, someone brings up states' rights.
And that's no coincidence. The very foundation of the Confederacy was built on the idea of state sovereignty. The belief that individual states had the right to defy federal law and even secede from the Union.
And even though the Confederacy lost the war, that idea of states' rights never really went away, did it?
It didn't. It became a very powerful rallying cry for those who opposed federal intervention in areas like, civil rights, economic policy, and social welfare.
It's fascinating how a concept born in the fires of the Civil War is still being used to shape debates about the role of government today.
It's a reminder that these issues aren't just abstract theoretical discussions. They have deep historical roots and real-world consequences.
And speaking of real-world consequences, we can't ignore the ongoing struggle for racial justice in America. We've seen how Black Americans played a crucial role in the Civil War, fighting for their freedom and helping to redefine the meaning of the conflict.
And yet, the end of slavery didn't magically erase centuries of racism and inequality.
Right.
Reconstruction, as we discussed earlier, was a period of both progress and backlash, a battle for the soul of the nation that continues to this day.
It's heartbreaking to think about how the hope and promise of Reconstruction were met with such fierce resistance. The rise of Jim Crow laws, segregation, and just systemic discrimination in the decades following the war. It's a tragic chapter in our history.
Yeah, and while the civil rights movement of the 20th century achieved significant victories, the fight for racial justice is far from over. We're still grappling with the legacies of slavery and segregation in areas like education, housing, healthcare, and criminal justice.
The echoes of the Civil War are undeniable. From the Black Lives Matter movement to the debates over Confederate monuments and the teaching of history in schools, we're still wrestling with the same fundamental questions about race and equality that divided the nation back then.
It's a reminder that history isn't just something that happened in the past. It's a living force that shapes our present and influences our future.
It's like those ripples we were talking about. They just keep expanding outward, touching every aspect of our lives.
And that's why it's so important to engage with history, to understand its complexities, and to learn from both its triumphs and its failures.
We can't just sweep the uncomfortable parts under the rug or pretend that the past is irrelevant to our present.
Exactly. We need to confront those uncomfortable truths, to grapple with the legacies of injustice, and to use that knowledge to build a more just and equitable future.
That's a powerful message, and I think it's a fitting way to conclude our deep dive into the Civil War and its enduring legacy.
It's been a fascinating journey, exploring not just the events of the war itself, but also its profound and lasting impact on American society.
We've uncovered surprising connections, challenged assumptions, and hopefully sparked some new questions and insights for you, our listener.
And as you continue to explore these topics on your own, remember that history isn't just a collection of dates and names. It's a tapestry of human experiences, a story that's still being written.
So keep digging, keep questioning, and keep connecting the dots between the past, the present, and the future.
Because as we've seen today, the echoes of the Civil War are all around us, reminding us that the fight for freedom, equality, and justice is a never-ending story.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.